I'd like to welcome everyone to the Washington History Seminar, sponsored by the National History Center and the Woodrow Wilson Center. Our speaker today is Michael Dobbs. He is a former Wilson Center scholar. He is a foreign correspondent and a historian, or to get the balance right, he is a historian as well as a journalist. He joined the Washington Post in 1980. He is the author of the Cold War trilogy. This is the series of books about the beginning and end of the Cold War. Down with Big Brother, The Fall of the Soviet Union, was published in 1996. The next book on the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1 Minute to Midnight, was a New York Times bestseller. And the last book in the Cold War trilogy is 6 Months in 1945, From World War to Cold War. So it gives me a great pleasure to introduce to you Michael Dobbs.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Two of my books have actually been helped by grants from the Kennan Institute and the Woodrow Wilson Center. When I came back from Moscow as a correspondent for the Washington Post in 1993, I wrote a book called Down with Big Brother, and the place I wrote it was the Kennan Center. Actually, we weren't here then. We were over opposite the castle in different surroundings. But then I came back to the Kennan Center a couple of years ago, again as a guest scholar for the Kennan Institute to do some of the research for this book. So I feel that my time here is very much associated with my research into the Cold War and my thinking about the Cold War. I'm very grateful for the time I spent here and the conversations I had. So, as you probably noticed, the so-called Cold War trilogy, which sounds a grand term, was actually written in reverse, so I didn't actually plan it as a trilogy at all. I spent most of my working career as a journalist, not as a scholar, and the big story that I witnessed as a journalist, as a reporter, was the collapse of communism. I was in Poland in 1980 to 81, which you can identify as the beginning of the collapse of communism. And I was in Moscow, Soviet Union, from 1988 to 93, which saw the fall of the Berlin Wall and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. So my interest in the Cold War really arises from my personal experiences and what I witnessed. And when I came back from Moscow for my first stint at the Kennan Center, what I wanted to do was to, they say that journalism is the first rough draft of history. And I wanted to write the second rough draft of history, to go deeper than I had been able to do as a reporter, to delve into the archives, which were at that point, even though it was only a few years after, a lot of new stuff was coming out, particularly from the Soviet archives. And I wanted to describe how this all took place. My sort of guiding, my inspiration, I guess, was Barbara Tuchman, The Guns of August. I thought it was there's now a debate about its historical accuracy, but in terms of describing, carrying the reader along, setting scenes, developing characters, I think Barbara Tuchman is the master. So I tried to emulate some of her techniques in my own books. So I wrote a book about the end of the Cold War, describing, I kind of weave my own experiences into it, but it's largely events that I didn't witness personally. And for a journalist, it's a huge honor and a huge opportunity to be able to get into all those meetings that you weren't able to get into as a reporter, which finally became possible thanks to the opening of the archives, to be the fly on the wall. And I tried to use that same technique, the fly on the wall technique, from multiple perspectives in my second book, 1 Minute to Midnight. And of course, the main, it was, I think what made 1 Minute to Midnight an original book in the Cuban Missile Crisis context was that I was able to tell the story from multiple perspectives, not just the United States and the ExComm and the White House, but also the Soviet Union and the Cubans, and not just from the people at the top, but as I'm going to explain, I think the people at the bottom play a very important role in history, particularly during the Cuban Missile Crisis and the origins of the Cold War. So having written those two books, I decided to go back to the beginning and try to describe how it all happened. I described the end of the Cold War. I described what you can think of as the peak of the Cold War, the missile crisis, and I wanted to understand the origins of the Cold War. So that was my motivation in researching this book. I make three large claims in this book. I say that the Cold War began in this 6-month period in 1945. I open at Yalta in February of 1945, and I close with the Potsdam Conference, the defeat of Japan, and most importantly, the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, which symbolizes the beginning of the atomic era, which really defined the whole course of the Cold War. I think that everything that happens subsequently, and of course there's a huge historiography about the Cold War, can be traced back to this 6-month period. I also think that the Cold War was inevitable, that whatever the personalities involved, I think would have ended up in much the same place. In this, I disagree with, some of you may have read the works of Frank Costigliola, who puts a huge emphasis on Roosevelt's personality versus Truman's personality, the personalities of the diplomats in Moscow, and so on and so forth. I think all that played a relatively small part, and that there were much larger forces at work, which we can explain, which I'll try to explain and we can discuss. My third claim is that I think this beginning of the Cold War was in some ways more visible from the bottom than from the top. In some ways, often the leaders are the last to figure out what the hell is going on. When I was a reporter in Moscow, every sort of field office has arguments with their masters back home. But I was struck by the fact, that the Washington debate is somehow completely divorced from what is happening in the field. And I think, in a way, that we can see this take place at the beginning of the Cold War as well, that the leaders were doing their best to, they didn't want a Cold War, they wanted to do their best to avoid a Cold War, for different reasons they wanted a period of détente, but they were pushed into a Cold War really pretty much by forces outside their control. And it's at the lower level, the level of ordinary Russian and American soldiers, ordinary Russian and American diplomats, that you see what is happening sometimes more clearly than at the level of the statesmen, the senior diplomats and the politicians. So this brings me to a kind of recurring theme throughout all my books. What is the role of the individual, and what is the role of grand forces in history? And I think it varies from time to time. I mean, I think in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the personalities of Khrushchev and Kennedy were ended up being extremely important. But there are other times in history when I think that the personality is less important. And this is a kind of paradox about the beginning of the Cold War, because you have these outsized personalities, the four people on the cover of my book, Stalin, FDR, Truman, and Churchill, the giants of the age, who, in my view at least, were not determined, didn't determine the future course of events. There's the Abraham Lincoln question. Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, said, "I don't control events, events control me." And I think that can be applied to FDR, Stalin, Truman, and Churchill during this period. But, I'm happy to have a back and forth about that with you later. So, having said that I don't think these leaders were determining, I think they're still extraordinarily interesting, and it's important to study them. And this is a unique period to study them, actually, because they saw a lot of each other. I mean, in modern-day politicians, they fly in for a meeting and then they fly out again. They don't meet each other and get to know each other in the same way that people were able to get to know each other back then. It was a kind of revolving house party where they met for weeks at a time. Churchill bilaterally, trilaterally, in many different ways. But the three leaders had already met at Tehran, I think, for about a week. At Yalta, they met for another week. And then at Potsdam, they met for 2 weeks. And they didn't just meet in the plenary sessions. They had dinner with each other. They met each other outside the plenary sessions. They really got to know each other in a way that modern-day politicians are not able to get to know each other so well. And what makes this even more extraordinary is that this is Stalin taking part in this kind of revolving house party, a guy who was very little known in the West, who made a cult of secrecy. This period is actually the best opportunity, was the best opportunity for Westerners to become close to Stalin and try to sort of figure out what motivated him. Now these people, this is a photograph of one of their dinners at Yalta, where they stayed in the Levadia Palace. The Levadia Palace had been constructed by the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, as a kind of summer retreat. And they put it at the disposal of it was Roosevelt's private residence in Yalta, but it was also the place where they convened. Now, what were these people like when they came to Yalta? What were their circumstances? FDR was a dying man when he arrived at Yalta. He was inaugurated for the 4th time. I think it was on January, I believe on January 10th. When would it have been? 20th, right. January 20th, he was inaugurated. By February the 4th, he was in Yalta. He left immediately after to take a very dangerous trip across the Atlantic. And he arrived it took him almost a week, almost 2 weeks to get to Yalta. And the conference opens, he arrives on February the 2nd, and the conference opens on February 4th. He was suffering from all kinds of ailments at this point. He had a couple of doctors with him. He came with his daughter, Anna, who was seriously concerned about her father's health, but all his medical condition was a secret, although it was pretty obvious to anybody who looked at him at Yalta. Both the Russians and the British, understood that he was a dying man. He could not focus on work, and only in fact worked, he was unable to read his briefing books. He worked for, at most, a couple of hours a day. This is him with Anna in the back of the Jeep, making a little tour of the Levadia grounds. What were FDR's goals at Yalta? Before I get to this, this slide at the bottom is the Levadia Palace on a particularly beautiful stretch of the Crimean coastline, a bit like the coastline of Northern California. And this shows FDR arriving at Yalta, arriving in the Crimea, going over the mountains to Yalta. He stayed at the Levadia Palace. Stalin stayed just down the road at the Karez Palace, which was built by the family that assassinated Rasputin. And the Vorontsov, Churchill stayed at the Vorontsov Palace. They were all within a few miles of each other. As a big concession, Stalin said, well, he would come 2 miles down the road to meet Roosevelt at the Levadia Palace, so that Roosevelt wouldn't be any more put out than he already was. Of course, Stalin was in a much more healthy condition than FDR at this point. So what were FDR's main goals at Yalta? I think he had 2 main goals. One was that he wanted to bring the Soviet Union into the war against Japan. And his principal thinking at this point was he wanted to save American lives. It was rather quite a cynical calculation. And it had applied not just to bringing the Soviet Union into the war against Japan, it also applied to the whole course of the war, that more dead Russians meant fewer dead Americans. It was to save American lives. Secondly, he wanted to show the American people that after all the sacrifices of the war, that they were able to establish a permanent peace, that he would achieve something that Woodrow Wilson had not been able to achieve after the First World War. And he associated that with setting up a durable United Nations structure. Those were his 2 main goals at Yalta. This is a photograph of Stalin, Molotov, and Vyshinsky, the deputy foreign minister, who plays a big role in many of these events. Stalin's goals. When the 2 met at Yalta, the Red Army had already penetrated deep into Germany. I have a map in the book which shows the conference opens on February the 4th. Over the course of the past month, they have swept across Poland, occupied practically all of eastern Prussia with the exception of Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, and they had crossed the Oder River and come to within 39 miles of Berlin. The US and the British still not entered Germany at all. They were on the other side of the Rhine, and they're still mopping up after the Battle of the Bulge. So there's a complete disparity in the military situation between what the successes of the Soviet army and the situation of the Western Allies. The Soviet Union was in full control almost of all of Eastern Europe, including Poland. These were the facts on the ground that were being negotiated. And to me, the question, did FDR lose Poland? It's rather like the question of, did we lose China? The point is that Poland was not ours to lose. It had already been lost or not lost, but it had already been occupied by the Soviet army when the Yalta Conference opened. Stalin was well aware of the sacrifices of the Red Army, more aware than anybody else. 3.5 million Germans had been killed on the Eastern Front. On the Western Front, were killed in the Eastern Front in the entire war. On the Western Front, 1 million Germans were killed in all the other parts of the Western Front, including Italy, North Africa, and France, 1 million Germans. Actually, at this particular period, the disparity was even greater. So the Russians had killed 3 to 4 times as many Germans as the Americans. This is something you don't hear very much about in all this talk about the greatest generation and the effectiveness of, we tend to ignore what happened on the Eastern Front. Stalin understood that Roosevelt wanted him in the war against Japan in order to save American lives, and he was going to exact a political price for that. And he laid out his price at Yalta. It included the whole of Sakhalin Island, the Kuril Islands, various territorial concessions in China. He was also determined, his main goal was to hang on to everything that the Red Army had occupied, including Poland, which he saw as a constant source of trouble to Russian rulers, whether they were communists or czars. He wanted to hold on to his gains. Stalin had a saying. He said that there's in international relations there is arithmetic and there is algebra, and I prefer arithmetic. By arithmetic, he meant, what the communists call correlation of forces. How many people in one army, how many people on the other army, how many people are occupying this territory. By algebra, he talks about the sort of grand ideas for building a post-Cold War order, which were dear to Roosevelt's heart, but Stalin didn't pay very much attention to them because he thought this was not the essence. He wanted to focus on the arithmetic rather than the algebra. The third leader, of course, was Churchill at Yalta. The most colourful, outsized of all these leaders in many ways. And he would stay in bed half the night. He would get up he rarely got up before noon. His great moment in the sun had been when Britain was fighting alone against Germany. He was no longer able to sort of determine the course of history in the way he had been able to determine it at the beginning of the war. He suffered from depression. He was not admitted to many of the meetings that took place at Yalta between Stalin and Roosevelt, particularly when they were discussing the war in Japan. He wanted to protect his special relationship with FDR, and he was jealous of his relationship with FDR. But FDR wanted to establish a personal relationship with Stalin. And so there's this kind of constant tension there. FDR thought he could charm Stalin. He was very confident in his abilities to charm people, and he thought he could bring Stalin into the Western club and influence him. I think Churchill had fewer illusions about that, but he too sort of thought he could. He once said, well, if Stalin and I had dinner once a week, we'd solve all the international problems. So the fourth big actor is Truman, of course, in this 6-month period. On April 14th, Roosevelt dies, April 12th rather, Roosevelt dies and is replaced by his vice president, with whom he's had very little to do, actually. Truman was kept out of all these big decisions and didn't even read the minutes of the Yalta meeting, which were kept secret from him. He knew very little about what had been going on. He didn't know about the atomic bomb before he became president, or he only knew the sort of vague outlines. He wasn't fully briefed either on Yalta or the atomic bomb. And he had very little knowledge about foreign policy. I think contrary to, there's a sort of myth that when Truman came in, there was an immediate shift in American foreign policy from the conciliatory FDR to the suddenly tough Truman. The reality actually is that Truman, particularly in the first few weeks, he gained confidence as he went along. But in the first few weeks, his main goal was to continue FDR's legacy. He had few ideas of his own. He depended on his advisors, and his advisors were split between the people who thought the time had come for a tougher line towards the Soviet Union, particularly Averell Harriman, the US ambassador, to a lesser extent Burns, the Secretary of State, and people like, this is Joe Davies, who you hear very little about nowadays. But Joe Davies was the ultimate appeaser. Have any of you seen Mission to Moscow, the sort of wartime? Joe Davies had been the US ambassador to Moscow. He was married to Marjorie Merriweather Post. Some of you have probably been to her house here. But he thought that the US should lean over backwards and do as much as possible to establish good relations with the Soviet Union. He was one of Truman's key advisors during this period. Truman takes him to Potsdam with him. So the idea that suddenly Truman made this kind of turn to the hard line is not true. He was kind of torn between conflicting pieces of advice he was getting from different advisors, including Joe Davies, the recipient of the Order of Lenin. So the question I raised at the beginning, when did the Cold War start, and what was the impact of the leaders? We all know when the Cold War ended. I mean, the great symbol is the fall of the Berlin Wall, and in 1989, and I guess Yeltsin jumping up on the tank in August 1991 in Moscow. That's when the whole system collapsed. It's fairly clear. But there's a lot of historical debate about when the Cold War began. I think if you're looking for a symbol of the Cold War beginning, it is actually this photograph, or photographs like these, of American troops meeting with the Soviet troops at the Elbe near a place called Torgau in April of 1945. And as you see, this is a great festive occasion. It's sort of held up as one of the great moments of the war, when a symbol of Soviet-American cooperation. But in fact, very quickly, they would sort of have these festive celebrations that have a night of drinking, slapping each other's backs, and very quickly, at the lower level, relations would turn from friendship, hugging, to mistrust and downright enmity. And by the time you get to, this is in April of 1945, by the time you get to July of 1945, when the Americans have moved into Berlin, the two armies are actually shooting at each other in some cases. So wherever you look, actually, whether you look at wherever Americans and Russians came into contact in these 6 months, you see the same pattern. Official friendship, sort of brief moment of rejoicing over the victory against their common foe, Nazi Germany, and then quarreling over the spoils of victory. And you see this much more clearly at the bottom than you do at the top. Those soldiers that you saw, I just included this map because I think it does really illustrate the differing perspectives of the two armies. When they met on the Elbe there, you can see this is the April 25th, they met on the Elbe, 2 weeks after Truman became president. And this is the distance. I mean, just look at the distance that the Russians had to come in order to get to the Elbe. And look at the distance the Americans came. Of course, they came across the Atlantic. If you included that, it would be different. But at least the point is, how far did they have to, how much fighting did they have to do to get to where they came? And roughly everything is double on the Eastern Front than it is on the Western Front. The distances are twice as great. The number of battles are twice the size. The size of the battles are twice as great. The number of Germans they killed is, several times larger. So the American unit that met it's not a completely fair comparison, because the American unit that met the Russians, this Russian division, the 58th Guards Division, had started at Stalingrad and had to fight all the way across, all the way to to Germany, to the Elbe, whereas the American division didn't have to do a lot of fighting. But even so, just the sort of scale of the sacrifices borne by the Russians is several times more than the Americans. And the Russians were very conscious of this. They knew that they'd done most of the fighting. This is a photograph of an American tank meeting a Soviet Red Army supply cart. So in some ways there's sort of other disparities. So the Russians weren't as mechanized as the Americans. They didn't have the kind of equipment, but the two entirely different armies in the way they occupied places. The Russians lived off the land, whereas the Americans had a whole sort of logistic organization behind them. So this was an immediate culture shock when these two armies met in the heart of Europe. This photograph down below is of Torgau, the day the Americans met the Russians, or perhaps a couple of days later, on the Elbe. And you see the refugees here. They're all sort of picking up whatever they can. Many of them have come from across the Elbe. And they're all fleeing to the west. And when I say there's no moral equivalence between these two armies. The Russians did most of the fighting, but in terms of which army was greeted more favorably by the Germans, of course it was the US army. And the refugees were all going from one direction to another. There was nobody fleeing from west to east. They were all fleeing from east to west, like these refugees you see here. Of course, the looting, the rapes, all this kind of turned Germans and ultimately Europeans off against the Soviet liberators. And it affected the entire course of the Cold War. The Russians had made most of the sacrifices, but it was the Americans who had the more positive image, the more the Americans took twice as many German prisoners as the Americans, as the Russians, because the Germans obviously wanted to surrender to the Americans rather than the Russians, and this had an effect on everything that happened subsequently. In order to control their part of Eastern Europe, their part of Germany, the Soviets had to divide the country. There was no way of having a united country with one part controlled by the Russians and the other part controlled by the Americans. People would vote with their feet, as you see them doing here, and go to the American side. So it's this disparity, I think, this lack of moral equivalence and lack of equivalence in sacrifice that is the sort of the initiator of many of the things you see happening during the Cold War. The Americans and Russians didn't just meet at the Elbe. They met all over Europe. This photograph is from a US air base at Poltava in the Ukraine. We set up a bomber shuttling base in the Ukraine so that American bombers, instead of turning back towards Britain, would be able to land on Soviet-controlled territory. And it started off again as a great symbol of American-Russian cooperation and friendship, and it quickly turned sour. And by April, I went through a lot of the records of this, of the American units that were stationed at this base. And by April of 1945, it's almost sort of enmity between Americans and Russians. The Russians, meanwhile, there's less documentation on the Russian side, but also you can see it on the Russian side to a certain extent with the NKVD reports back up to Stalin. Both sides were essentially preparing for war in this little kind of microcosm of an American Soviet air base. Seems to be out of... So in addition to Poltava, they were also meeting in Romania. Actually, a few days after the Yalta Conference. I think the Yalta Conference ends in the middle of February. By the end of February, Wyszynski, the man you saw in the photograph there, the deputy foreign minister, he is being sent by Stalin to organize what amounts to a coup, overturning a pro-Western government in Romania and installing an effective pro-Soviet regime under the guise of a popular front. The American diplomats who enjoyed great privileges in Romania suddenly find themselves sort of isolated, losing this power struggle with the Russians. Bulgaria, we think of politicians fleeing to opposition figures, fleeing to American embassies. Cardinal Mindszenty, for example, in 1956 in Hungary, taking refuge in the US embassy in Hungary. This happened in Bulgaria with the opposition leader Georgi Dimitrov in June, I think it was, of 1945. That's why I'm trying to say that everything that happened later, you actually see the same things happening in this particular period. Churchill's great expression, the Iron Curtain, of course, he makes his Iron Curtain speech in 1946 in Fulton, Missouri. But he's using the phrase, an Iron Curtain has descended across Europe, as early as April, May of 1945. And he's referring to the situation in Romania with American and British diplomats who are being forbidden from traveling around the country. Information is being denied to them, and our people are not allowed to move as they want. And it's in this context that he introduces this Iron Curtain imagery. So often the Iron Curtain speech in March 1946 is taken as a kind of symbolic start of the Cold War. But the Iron Curtain, in the sense of an information curtain, was imposed in this period, in this 6 months, as soon as Americans and Russians and Westerners came into contact with each other in Europe. And most of all, I think, this clash of ideologies, clash of cultures, clash of goals is visible in Berlin. I was very struck when I researched the Potsdam Conference, which is in July of 1945. You have the leaders are all meeting in Potsdam in the Cecilienhof Palace, and 15 miles down the road, the American army has already moved into Berlin, and there's a kind of turf war going on between the Americans and the Russians and the British, to a lesser extent, for control of the city. The Russians are trying to preserve their influence in West Berlin, and the Americans are determined not to let them do this. The Russians are engaged in various sort of black market activities that the Americans frown upon, and you get actual incidents of American soldiers shooting and killing Soviet soldiers when they try to come into the western part of Berlin. So at this stage, Truman is still committed to finding a common language with Stalin, and Stalin is committed, at least in this is how he presents it, to finding an understanding with the West, but their armies at a lower level are already coming to blows. I think this is sort of clearest in a way when you look at the two economic systems that they imposed. You had the command centralized economy meeting the free market economy in Berlin with one currency. The Americans had invented a new currency, the occupation mark, to replace the Reichsmark. And they gave the plates of this currency to the Russians. And of course, the Russians printed as many of these things. They printed occupation marks, paid their soldiers in these paper currencies. The soldiers went off and bought sucked up whatever they could on the black market. And then the U.S. Army, for American soldiers, would convert all those occupation marks back into U.S. dollars. American soldiers who had the good fortune to be stationed in Berlin in July 1945 were making a fortune. They were, sell a camera or sell cigarettes Cigarettes was the most popular currency. In the black market, this is right on the corner of the Reichstag in Berlin, for inflated prices. And then the US Army, the suckers, would convert this back into dollars, and people were sending back home 7 or 8, 10 times as much as they were actually earning. Finally, the US Army figured out that something was amiss here and put a stop to it. But that's a kind of vivid illustration that you can't just take one economic system and marry it to another. This was still at a time when the principle of the leaders was to have a unified Germany with a unified economic system. But at the ground level, lower down, it was not working, and that was visible from the black market. But the most, hanging over all of this is the atomic bomb. And as soon as the two armies move into Germany, even before the first nuclear test, even before we know that the atomic weapons are going to work, each army is trying to find, discover, and collect as many atomic materials as they can and deny it to the other side. And this was not aimed against Germany. This was aimed against the World War II ally. This is a photograph of a German primitive nuclear reactor being dismantled by a team of experts from a group called Alsos, whose job it was to go into Germany and control the uranium, recruit as many German scientists as possible, and deny these precious supplies and expertise to the other side. And of course the Russians were doing exactly the same thing. They had their equivalent of the Alsos mission, and they were trying to recruit German scientists and to control uranium supplies. So this competition was going on at this very same time. And in fact, it's at Potsdam that Truman hears the news that the first atomic test has been successful and decides to use the atomic bomb against Japan, which changes the power equation between the Soviet Union and the United States. We no longer need the Soviet Union to intervene to enter the war in the Far East in order to save American lives. We have this miracle weapon which will do the job equally effectively. In fact, there's a sea change in American attitudes at this point. From wanting the Soviets in the war, they decide they don't want them in the war. And of course, Stalin is very quick to pick up on this. So, wrapping up now, but I just want to sort of look ahead through the course of the Cold War, and to say a few words about what happened later and the effect of nuclear weapons. I think nuclear weapons, they froze the contribution they made, or the change they made, was to freeze the military contest in Europe in a way that turned out to be very favorable to the United States. The Soviet Union had an advantage in conventional power in Europe. With the nuclear age, nuclear weapons froze that military contest. And we had to look for other ways of competing, at least in Europe. And there's sort of proxy fights going on in other parts of the world. But in Europe, war became unimaginable. And that worked out to the benefit of the United States, actually, because we did not have a military advantage over the Soviet Union. But we did have a moral advantage. And we were a stronger economy, a stronger sort of a more a way of life and a political system that was more appealing to people in Eastern Europe, to people in Germany, and ultimately to people even people in Russia. And so the Cold War was in fact one of the last wars we actually won. And I think we were able to do so by freezing the military competition and focusing on these other areas where we had a comparative military advantage. So just to end with, I begin the book by talking about de Tocqueville, of course. Everybody talks about de Tocqueville. And I have a paragraph here that tries to summarize what the message of the book. The 6 months from Yalta to Hiroshima form a hinge between two very different wars and two very different worlds. They connect the age of artillery with the age of the atomic bomb, the death throes of empire with the birth pangs of superpowers. They also mark the fateful encounter in the heart of Europe between the armies of two great nations, ostensibly allied but guided by opposite ideological principles. More than a century earlier, Alexis de Tocqueville had predicted that Americans and Russians would sweep all other nations aside. The principal instrument of the former, America, is freedom, he wrote, of the latter, servitude. This is in 1835. Their starting point is different and their courses are not the same, yet each of them seems marked out by the will of heaven to sway the destinies of half the globe. This is the story of the people, presidents and commissars, generals and foot soldiers, victors and vanquished, who fulfilled de Tocqueville's will of heaven. So I probably talked for far too long, but happy to try to defend my ideas and listen to your arguments. How would you like to proceed?
Thank you, Michael. We've all lived so much with the Cold War that it is a real service to have such a bold survey about the origins and the consequences. Just to say preliminary question, reverting back to the beginning where you emphasized Roosevelt's two aims of saving lives and the other side, the permanent peace. You didn't really pursue very much the second aim. Can you tell us just a little bit about Stalin's aims, attitude towards the establishment of the United Nations and how this worked out on their side?
Well, Stalin was a master preparer. He read everything that came across his desk. In fact, he read a lot a lot of the American briefing books that FDR didn't bother to read. In Soviet files, you find actually American briefing papers. I say this as an aside, but by the way, one of the member of the US delegation at Yalta was Alger Hiss, who later became the Secretary General of the United Nations. United Nations is also formed in this period. But the one thing that Stalin was not really interested in, and he didn't really bother, and in fact and he confesses at one point that he hadn't even sort of focused his attention on, was all the founding documents of the United Nations. This was to him, as I said, just algebra. And he thought that's sort of something that FDR is interested in. He didn't make very big arguments about how it should be set up. He argues at one point that he wants Ukraine and Belarus to have separate seats in the General Assembly. And that's why FDR conceded that. But in general, he wasn't all that interested in it, because he didn't think that it was the real that was not where power lay as far as he was concerned. He sends Molotov, by the way, in the founding conference, I guess, is just at the end of the war in April of 1945, I think before the war ends. And Molotov, this is just after FDR's death, actually. FDR has got this great goal in mind of going to being present at the opening of the United Nations founding conference in San Francisco. But he dies about just a couple of weeks before it's due to open. And Stalin's Harriman's bequest really sends Molotov to San Francisco. But the whole opening of the UN is overshadowed by the American-Russian dispute over Poland. At the same time, I didn't mention this, but it's worth noting, the Russians arrest a whole series of Polish underground leaders about who they trick to coming to talks and take them off and throw them into the Lubyanka. And the Americans and the British are very concerned about what's happened to these Polish underground leaders. And so that's the kind of number one controversy in San Francisco when Molotov finally arrives. And then there's actually a show trial organized in Moscow in, I think it's June, of these Polish underground leaders. So that was what Stalin thought was important, not the United Nations.
There will be a lot of questions, and could everyone please state their name clearly and your affiliation?
Stephen Shore. Stephen Shore, I'm with the PBGC, a domestic federal agency. Am I correct that the residences of Churchill and FDR were bugged at Yalta? And did they, if so, did they know it, and did it influence the negotiations?
Yeah, they half knew it. Actually, Beria's son, Sergio Beria, he wrote a book a number of years later in which he says that he was part of the team that bugged the residences of the Western leaders, both at Yalta and before that at Tehran. And at one point, Stalin is amazed at everything that the Americans are saying, and he says, I can't believe that they're being so open. I think the Americans, there was kind of some screening for bugs, actually mainly of the other kind of bugs, the bed bugs that bit them all the time. But they discussed a lot. They wouldn't discuss something hypersensitive like the atomic bomb project. They waited until they got out of Russia to talk about the atomic bomb. But they discussed a lot that was helpful to Stalin in making his strategy. And he would study all this stuff. Not only did they discuss it, but people like Hiss, you see American diplomatic documents in the Soviet archives. For example, the most obvious example is the whole State Department position on the Kurils. And the State Department was arguing against surrendering the Kurils to Kuril Islands to Russia. FDR didn't bother to read it, but a copy of the briefing paper is in Stalin's archives.
Yes.
Dieter Detke, Georgetown University. Thank you very much.
Repeat your...
Again, Dieter Detke, Georgetown University. Thank you very much. Very interesting and fascinating. And I just wanted to say there are two sides to the Cold War, of course. And you told us how the power conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States began. But there's also the ideological conflict. And the thesis is out that the Cold War really began in 1917. Would you give any credence to, the ideological side of the conflict? Because that seems to me is certainly older than the power conflict. But thank you for your interpretation of the power conflict. Wonderful.
Yeah, I didn't have time to mention the sort of contrasting ideologies, but I'm certainly thinking of that as well. Contrasting political, military interests, cultural systems, but also ideological systems. And in some ways, I think that the Americans were at least as ideological as the Soviets. Stalin was willing to kind of live and let live, i.e., if he controlled his part of Europe, of course, there were communist parties in France and Italy and so on, but he was willing to make a trade-off. That if the Americans allowed him to do what he wanted in Eastern Europe, that he wouldn't make too much of a fuss in Western Europe. And the proof of that is Greece, of course. Actually, which was the Stalin and Churchill had agreed the previous year that British would have 90% influence in Greece in return for the Soviet Union getting 90% influence in Romania and Hungary. And Stalin was quite happy with that kind of arrangement. The problem was, on the American side, though, that was sort of unacceptable. And I mean, on the British, Churchill keeps on reminding everybody that Britain drew the sword on behalf of Poland. I mean, there's a kind of romantic or attachment to Poland because it was the reason Britain went to war in the first place. But for America, I was actually going to read you a comment by Harry Hopkins, who visits Stalin in June of 1945 to sort out the problems they're having over Poland. And Hopkins, of course, is identified with the sort of the people who wanted to get on with Stalin, and he's not identified with the hardline camp at all. But this is what he says at the end of his talks with Stalin about Poland, which are not going anywhere. Hopkins tells Bolin that the American belief in freedom, as he puts it, could lead to serious differences over affairs in third countries. As he later wrote, the American people want not only freedom for themselves, they want freedom throughout the world for other people as well. They simply do not like the notion that you cannot say what you please when you want to say it. So you have these two universalist ideologies. They're kind of messianic ideologies, but in a way, the American position is more ideological than the Russian position, because the Russians were actually prepared for a cynical kind of division of Europe, when that was very hard for the Americans to stomach.
But isn't this, in a way, an argument that the Cold War actually, in a different sense, begins a little bit later? In other words, prepared to acknowledge the occupation, the division of Europe, but the idea of the expansionist Soviet Union, doesn't that come later?
Well, except that even the sort of expansionist, Turkey, we had, I think, at the Woodrow Wilson Center a year ago, I was at one of these history seminars with somebody who's done a lot of work on Turkey, Azerbaijan, southern Azerbaijan in Iran, and he shows that, this goes right back to this period. It's during this period that Stalin first makes claims to parts of Turkey and parts of northern Iran, and is trying to sort of grab northern, what was called southern Azerbaijan. So I have a section on that. But I think the way. So I think all these conflicts you can trace back to this period, including the sort of quarrel over what we might call Soviet expansionism. By the way, on the difference between the traditionalists and the revisionists, I sort of kind of waded into this huge historiographic debate without really, like a kind of innocent. And I come out, each side is trying to show that the other side was responsible, that the traditionalists say, well, it was all the fault of Stalin and the Soviet Union. And the revisionists say, well, no, it was actually the fault of the United States. I think it was nobody's fault. It was just the way things actually turned out, given the conflicting economic, ideological and political natures of these two systems identified by de Tocqueville and people like him. I think, is there right at the back? Yeah.
Hello, my name's Alex McVeigh. I'm actually a student from Murdoch University in Perth, Western Australia. So I didn't come just for this, but I would have if I knew. 29 hours in transit, it's definitely worth it. I noticed something that you said earlier towards the beginning of the Cold War in 1945 when we were speaking of FDR wanting to bring the Russians into the Pacific side of the war. Mm-hmm. And I have reason to believe that there's a theory out there that Truman chose to drop the bomb in order to keep the Russians out of the war. I'm interested to know to what extent the personalities of Roosevelt and Truman actually changed the relationship between America and the Russians, rather than their policies themselves, but more their personalities, if in any way at all. And
well, this is basically the sort of essence of the revisionist argument, that here was Roosevelt, who was getting on very well with the Russians and with Stalin, and was wanting to follow that line. And then Truman comes along with a different personality, a more abrasive personality, and starts sort of waving the atomic weapon around and trying to browbeat the Russians, and thus we get the Cold War. That's kind of, in a nutshell, the revisionist argument. I mean, I think the revisionist argument is a helpful corrective to some of the things that the traditionalists were claiming, but I don't really buy the kind of central point of the revisionist argument, which is that they were using this sort of atomic diplomacy argument, that the atomic bomb was really aimed against the Soviet Union rather than Japan. I think, of course, that was the way the Russians perceived it in some ways. I mean, I think at one point Stalin does say that, we are the target here. I mean, he was sort of, paranoid, and he definitely saw it as aimed against him. I think that the atomic bomb was used against Japan to end the war and with minimum cost to American lives, although in the back of the minds of the Americans, or some of the Americans, and they say this in their diaries, they were also thinking about, this will strengthen our position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and Stalin. But I don't think that was the primary purpose of dropping the bomb on Japan. And that's where I differ with I think it was there, but I don't think it was the primary purpose.
Yes.
Yeah, you meant David Dvorkin from the Air and
You
Space.
identify yourself.
Yeah, David Dvorkin from the Air and Space Museum, Smithsonian. Is that sufficient? Okay. You mentioned Alsace, and that the Russians were, of course, engaged equally. And these, the forces and drives that produced these efforts certainly came from not the front and not the European people on the scene, but people and forces and institutions in the homelands. And so how does that fit into your model, if maybe I'm oversimplifying your model, when you say that it was the personal clash between cultures on the ground in Europe that was a factor in stimulating the inevitability of this war? Because it seems like Alsace and things like that were definitely thought of quite early.
Yeah, I mean, I see the personal clash as just the symptom of these, deep-seated divergences between the two economic, political, ideological systems. So it's not that that this was the personal animosities in Berlin or in Poltava or somewhere else were the kind of driving forces. No, of course not. It was just the kind of evidence of these sort of deep-rooted animosities. So in terms of Alsace, yeah, I mean, this was in the basic interest of both countries, was to control whatever might have taken place at Yalta or was going to take place at Potsdam. They understood very clearly that, the war was over, the common foe was vanquished, and that they needed to, each side needed to control these atomic materials. I mean, you're saying that, okay, that was a decision taken by a leader, and therefore this is sort of this is evidence that the leaders are really determining what happens. Is that basic? Sorry? Yeah. Yeah.
Maintaining a war basis on some grounds, somewhere.
I think it was I'm not sure that Truman approved Alsace. Perhaps he did. He may have done. I think it was just it just sort of grew out of the different interests, which were fairly obvious to everybody, that, we needed to recruit all these German scientists. Why? Because otherwise they would be recruited by the other side. And the other side at that point was not Nazi Germany any longer. It was the Soviet Union. So, I mean, there was a lot of talk, do we share the atomic secrets with the Soviets? And some people favored sharing atomic secrets, including Stimson at one point. I don't think that was, I think when it came down to it, and when they kind of realized where US interests lie, there was no way that was going to happen. Once they got, the Alsos mission was kind of evidence of that. That in the end you don't share your atomic secrets, and Stalin certainly wasn't going to. He had a very active espionage effort against the Los Alamos and the other nuclear institutions. Actually, and he didn't expect the Americans to share their atomic secrets. The paradox is actually, this is one of the great scenes at Potsdam, is that Churchill and Truman are discussing among themselves. They think, well, they have to bring Stalin into the secret of the first atomic test somehow. How are they going to tell him about this new weapon? And they think they don't want to do it officially, so they decide, well, Truman will just go and kind of drop it casually in conversation, that we have this, they didn't even say an atomic weapon, they said we have this incredibly powerful new weapon. And they think they've tricked Stalin. Stalin wasn't tricked at all. He had spies in Los Alamos who were keeping him well informed. He probably knew more than Truman did, certainly up until April of 1945. And he was kind of just biding his time and waiting for seeing how the Americans were going to broach this subject. So, I think the idea that we were going to, that there was a real choice there, given the conflicting nature of these two systems, that we were actually going to share all this atomic secrets with the Russians, I think it was a non-starter, but other people might disagree with that.
Yes.
Michael, Dave Ottaway, former colleague of Michael's at the Washington Post. Michael, going back to when the soldiers first discover they don't like each other, when they first get together, is it because of sort of previous ideological indoctrination on both sides, or are they don't like each other because one has better food than the other? Or, what are the issues over which these simple soldiers fight and discover they don't like each other?
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I don't think it's because of indoctrination at all, actually. In fact, if the indoctrination is going the other way, there was sort of anti-Soviet indoctrination in the 30s, but once they became our ally in the Second World War, if anything, we were kind of building them up as the great ally and friend, and going to the ridiculous extremes of kind of glossing over. For Katyn, for example, the Americans and the British hushed up Katyn, although the evidence was even then fairly clear. Didn't want to talk about it because they didn't want to offend the great Russian ally. And movies were coming out during the war at the popular cultural level, like this Mission to Moscow movie came out, sort of building the Soviet Union up. If you've seen it, it's just boggles the mind now. It looks like sort of Russia is made to look like some idyllic place in Switzerland. And so this is how people were being fed. So actually, Americans, when they first met Russians, were kind of quite well disposed to them. And the same is true of the British. They went, but they quickly turned around. And they turned around because of what they saw. This is again where I disagree about Castiglione. I'm sort of coming back to him. But he has a theory that, you had all these American diplomats in Russia who were against the Russians because they came from sort of waspish backgrounds, and they had problems. They had affairs with Russian ballerinas, and the Russians wouldn't talk to them, and so on and so forth. I think all that is nonsense. The Russian diplomats in Moscow, people like Harriman, when he went to Moscow, was quite favorably disposed to the Russians. It was the experiences they had which changed their minds. And they were close on the ground and observed, what was happening, how the Russians were behaving. And at the lower level, at the level of ordinary soldiers, they saw what was going on. They saw the looting. They heard stories of the rapes. When they moved into Berlin, somebody would go in and they'd commandeer a German house, and all the furniture had been destroyed. And, That was what turned them against them, not the ideological indoctrination at all. In fact, the official position of the US Army and the US government was completely the reverse at this point. It was, these people are our friends, we have to get on with them. And, that was the same on the Russian side too, to some extent, that they were also under instructions to get on well with, but more warily with the Americans. But it's just, the way things turned out when these two very different kinds of armies and people met each other. I mean, the Russians would say they went into a house, for example. I found some letters from American soldiers, writing back home just after they'd met the Russians at Torgau on the Elbe. And they'd say, well, this is all extraordinary. When we sort of respect or try to respect I'm not saying the US Army didn't commit any crimes, but, they were minor compared to the Soviet crimes committed by the Soviet Army. But the Russians lived off the land. They had to billet themselves in the house. And the first thing they would do, an American would go into a house and he'd find a nice bed and he would sleep in it. The Russian occupation soldiers would typically, the first thing that happened was they'd throw all the furniture into the street and they'd sleep on the floor. And, the Americans' eyes were sort of bulging at this. They wanted to sleep in the beds but the Russians were kind of, first of all, they wanted to exact revenge. And secondly, all this stuff was loot to be shipped back to Russia. And this had an effect on people, on the ordinary American soldiers who witnessed it. Actually, there's a kind of joke said about Stalin in Berlin. I mean, Berlin, when Stalin came to Berlin in July 1945, this was the moment of triumph for him. He was the conqueror of Berlin. And by getting the Americans and the British to meet him in Berlin, they were meeting him on his ground. But it was a mistake from Stalin's point of view, because for the first time, the Americans and British at a higher level saw what the people at the lower level were already seeing. They saw the looting that was going on. They went and Edwin Poley, who was the reparations chief for Truman, he went down and personally inspected the sort of rail yards where all this loot was kind of piling up. And that changed him. And it changed Truman's attitude too. But the joke was that Stalin made two mistakes at Potsdam, or two mistakes at the end of the war. One, he showed Russians Europe because these Russian soldiers, even though Germany was destroyed, it looked like a paradise for Russians. They moved into a house. It had furniture in it. It had full, well-stocked larders and so on and so forth. They thought, why can't we have this back in Russia? And secondly, Stalin showed Americans and Westerners Russia, or Russians. And, the two things were this sort of goes to the point that I was trying to make before of this lack of moral equivalence between the two armies, which I think you have to bear in mind.
There's a question here, yes.
I'm Ross Cormier. I'm retired. I noticed in the last few years, whenever there's an article, editorial, or an op-ed piece in the Washington Post against Russia, against Putin, there are 4 letters and a long article in the New York Review of Books. Don't start a new Cold War. I always say, why not? We won that one. But you didn't warn us about that, not to start a new Cold War. What's your view on this?
You mean starting a new Cold War or what?
Yes, or not starting, or just being normal with the
On
Russians.
Putin. I mean, I think, having lived in the Soviet Union under the communist period, whatever you may say about Putin, he's not Stalin, and the system that he has imposed there or is developing there is not a Soviet communist system. I think he's reverting back to type in many ways. He's become a sort of traditional authoritarian Russian leader in the style of so many Russian leaders. I was actually reading Robert Massey's book about Catherine the Great. I don't know if this perhaps this is diverging from the point here, but reading Massey's book about Catherine the Great explained a lot to me about Russian politics, contemporary Russian politics. That Catherine the Great went to Russia. She was a German princess steeped in the ideas of the Enlightenment and the friend of Voltaire and Diderot and so on. And then she became a sort of repressive great power chauvinist, by the way, in the end. And we see the same, exactly the same pattern in Russia since the collapse of communism, as you see in the education of people like Catherine the Great, this German princess. But so, I think what made the communist period different, a detour, was that the aspiration to sort of create a totalitarian society, which is sort of more than just a simple, was different from the sort of regular Russian autocracy. And so it was, it was an attempt to create a utopia, and the ideological component was important. But I think what Putin is trying to do is completely different. I think that period in Russian history is, that experiment is understood by everybody, including Putin, as a failure, and they won't go. Whatever they do, they're not going back to the communist experiment.
Right here.
I've been thinking about your.
Introduce yourself, please.
I'm Alex Wellerstein. I'm at the American Institute of Physics. And I've been thinking about the inevitability argument that you're making, which seems to me to be about, given the power relations, this is sort of inevitably the result that comes out of it. And one of the strong planks that you put that on is the atomic bomb. And one of the things I've been thinking about quite a bit is how inevitable is the fact that we even made the atomic bomb. I personally feel that it's actually somewhat of a lucky fluke to, if we had started certain processes of it 6 months later, it wouldn't have been ready by the time in Japan. It was just ready in time. If we had gone with the advice of some experts and not others, we wouldn't have even started the process in the first place. We'd be in the position that Germany was, or even Russia was, if, otherwise. And so part of me wants to say, well, okay, inevitable given the power relations, you can pin all of those atomic decisions down on actually a very small number of people, including Alsos, which is General Groves and people like that. Which leads to my question, if you took the atomic bomb out of the equation, how inevitable does the power situation get? If we imagined a hypothetical post-war in which we had not yet developed a bomb, and I know this is well beyond the realms of actual facts, but I'm just curious what your response would be.
Well, without the bomb, I think it would, there'd have been, the Cold War would have developed differently. And because there wouldn't have been this kind of freezing in place of the military contest that I mentioned. And you'd have had with the bomb, we immediately, in a stroke, neutralized the Soviet conventional advantage in conventional forces in Europe. And both sides understood that very clearly. So, and that kind of froze everything into place. Actually, this, the idea of the first person to use the expression Cold War was, I think, George Orwell. And he used it late in 1945, and it's in an essay of his about the bomb. And he says, the bomb changes everything, that we're kind of condemned to a kind of Cold War in which everything is frozen into place. And I think, I think that's the case. What would have happened without the bomb? I mean, still think things are moving in that direction. I mean, a case in point is Adolf Hitler, and we're talking about de Tocqueville predicting it, but Adolf Hitler was not a bad predictor either, and he didn't know that the Americans were on the point of getting a bomb. Okay, so this is what Hitler said. Hitler, with his twisted but occasionally brilliant grasp of historical forces, Hitler, in his last testament, this I guess is in about March of April 1945, concluded that the defeat of the Third Reich would leave only two great powers capable of confronting each other, the United States and Soviet Russia. He went on to predict that the laws of both history and geography will compel these two powers to a trial of strength, either military in the fields of economics, or either military or in the fields of economics and ideology. It's equally certain that both these powers will sooner or later find it desirable to seek the support of the sole surviving great nation in Europe, the German people. I mean, actually, as a sort of, forget about Hitler, but just as a political science prediction, that's not a bad one. And that he said that without knowing the facts about the bomb.
Arnita Jones.
I'm Arnita Jones with the American Education Research Association. You spent some time at the beginning talking about the distances traveled, the relationships developed, the sheer amount of time that they spent in these meetings. And it led me to wonder what's happening back home. That's a very different style of leadership. You have to have delegated more. Even paranoid Stalin has to have delegated more than I think Putin would want to or need to do today. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, that was one reason why Stalin didn't want to leave. Actually, he hated air travel. He did fly to Tehran, and the trip was such a trauma for him that he refused to fly by plane ever again. But this is one reason why he insisted on a meeting inside the Soviet Union rather than going outside. As for the Americans, yeah, actually they were operating the logistical limits of the American presidency, because you had to they had a whole system of couriers set up between the US and Yalta. It took them, I think, about 10 days, I've forgotten, at least a week to get the couriers from Washington with anything signed by Congress. Had constitutionally to be signed by the by Roosevelt as president and sent back he had to attend to his constitutional duties. And he couldn't go any further than the Crimea. It was about the kind of limit. So, I don't think Roosevelt at this stage was kind of worried about in the same way that you might think Stalin would be, but he wasn't worried about his political position back home. And he had he delegated authority. But it wasn't actually just Roosevelt that went to Crimea. He had the whole, half the government moved to Crimea, and they were all living in the Levadia Palace. This is including George Marshall, was just down the corridor in the Tsarina. George Marshall shared a suite with the Admiral King, the head of the Navy. And this is, I think some of the I've sort of talked in kind of grand political terms, but to me, the most interesting period is just the purely the human side of all this. How they met, how they talked, what they ate, how they gossiped about each other, because it reveals in very unusual circumstances the sort of human dimension of political leadership. These guys are just like us in the end, in much more extraordinary positions, of course.
Steve Weissman, independent political scientist. I was interested in two aspects of what you talked about. First, the notion that the conflict sort of welled up from below.
Mm-hmm.
That it's at the level of ordinary people feeling, I guess, the differences in the social systems and cultural systems, that this conflict is coming rather than from Roosevelt and Truman. It's sort of coming from the essence of the nation. What concerns me is I don't know what the link is between how a soldier in Europe felt meeting a Russian and the decision-making that was going on.
Right. Yeah, but I tried to explain that. It's not that it welled up from below in that sense. It's not that there was a link necessarily, but although eventually they certainly reported back, and their reports kind of influenced people. For example, the diplomats in Romania would report back about the hard time and that they were having, and that influenced Churchill's rhetoric about an Iron Curtain descending across Europe. I mean, that's a kind of direct link. But it's more in the. I'm saying that what happened at the bottom was kind of just symptomatic of this divergence between these two very different kind of societies and political and ideological systems.
The other part of my question then is, let's say, for the sake of argument, that let's take the argument over Germany between the different powers. And there were many different forces in the United States government that were presenting different positions on questions like German reparations, for example, and the occupation that would occur.
Yeah.
Let's say that the forces that didn't necessarily win, Stimson, let's say, and people like that, who were proposing alternatives that would be viewed by the Russians as less severe. Let's say they had won all the arguments. Certainly there would still have been conflict between the view of the world of the United States and Russia, but would we have had what we call the Cold War anyway if the people who are a little more reconciliationist had actually won those arguments, regardless of whatever the experience of the average soldier and so forth was?
Right. Yeah, I believe we would, because that was the way events were moving and people had to adapt. I mean, they were sometimes late in adapting. For example, Lucius Clay, for example, he goes to Berlin, Germany, tries as the kind of viceroy at about this time in the summer of 1945. And he's determined to make, the policy work. Fully determined. He wants to, when the people down below are complaining about how difficult it is to get on with the Russians, he sort of looks at them coldly and say, well, you don't understand the policy from Washington. But within a few months, he himself has turned around. He's discovered that it's actually impossible to run Germany as a united economy and, to uphold the reparations agreements and so on and so forth. Somebody like him is kind of forced by the logic of events and things that are happening on the ground to change his position. Stimson, who, he comes back from Berlin with a different view of Russians and Russia than the one he went to Berlin with. And in his memoirs, or I think he writes, he collaborated on his memoirs, he talks about how the experience of going to Berlin was actually very revealing for him. And he changed. So I think that, this undoubtedly happens that, the people who win the arguments, they themselves change their position. And, by early 1946, actually, Kennan writes about this all the time. Kennan is the long telegram that he writes in 1946. He was writing exactly the same thing in dispatches from Moscow for a period of 2 years, saying this is not going to work. The difference is that it's only in 1946 that people start listening to him. And he says this in his memoirs, that the point about the long telegram was not that there were kind of original ideas in it that changed everybody's minds in 1946. It was that by early 1946, the kind of frame of mind of people in the policymakers in Washington had changed to the extent that they were willing to accept his ideas. And in some cases they were different people, because people like Joe Davies were sort of gradually pushed aside. But in some cases they were the same people. Harriman is a very good example. Harriman went to Russia in 1943, I think it was 43, determined, he thought he could make his mark, and his agenda was cooperation with the Russians. And he didn't actually get on with Kennan very well in the beginning because they had different views. Kennan had become cynical long before. But by 1945, Harriman has changed his position, and he's become the sort of, he's warning of a barbarian invasion of Europe, and has become the leader of what we could call the Hawks. So this is why, and Truman is another case in point. Truman, it's not true that Truman comes into office and decides to adopt a tough policy towards the Soviet Union. He is pushed into that position over the course of many months. And even at Potsdam, he's still, wanting to have a occupied Germany, have a jointly occupied Germany. Even Stalin, by the way. It's wrong to see Stalin, Stalin doesn't want a Cold War either. He wants a period of time in which Russia can rebuild itself. But he sort of, and he would like to occupy Germany together, have a joint occupation regime, and he, is willing to make a number of concessions to the West in order to achieve this. But he sort of gradually, it's just the kind of facts of life and his need for political control over Eastern Europe that makes him realize that slowly that this is not going to work. And then he, gradually in the second half of 45 changes his position. That was not his preference at the beginning.
Michael, that makes for an excellent summing up, and we want to thank you for a very stimulating.
Well, here's I was going to donate this to the library.
Oh, that's terrific. Thank you. Make sure that they get it. Oh, yes, people, please join us for a glass of wine. Continue the discussion. Really good, really good.
Okay, well, I hope I didn't gas on too long.